to my dungeon.
Welcome to Kuldrin's Krypt. I'm your host, Master Kuldrin. If you're new to the show, I use my 23 years of BDSM experience and 20 years of working in the psychology field to dispel myths, get rid of stereotypes, and answer your questions about BDSM. You can call in at 865-268-4005 to leave your questions or visit the Krypt at kuldrinskrypt.com. On this episode of the Krypt, we are speaking with psychotherapist Stephen Ng about your magic sex number, talking to your children about sex, BDSM and religion, and much, much more. Before we get started, a quick side note. As the regular Krypters know, usually the audio quality is really good. We had some technical difficulties. Normally, I would redo it, but the content and the flow of this message was just too good to scrap. So stick with it. It's well worth it. On this episode of The Krypt, we're speaking with Stephen Ng, as described on his website, stephenng.com. That is ING, a paradigm shifter, conversation starter, psychotherapist, author, public speaker, father, and husband. Stephen, welcome to The Krypt.
Well, thanks. It's really great to be talking to you this morning.
I have been looking forward to this since I watched your TEDx talk, and that was the first thing. And then I started researching you because that's the person that I am. As soon as I find something interesting, I've got to know more and more about it. So let's jump into that TEDx talk. That was done in Nevada, correct?
Yeah, that's right. At the University of Nevada. Actually, this year, it was 2018 in January. And it's really a great video if people want to watch. It's about 11, 12 minutes long, something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes so people can also do their research with you and check you out. But what you talk about in there is something that, as I emailed to you as we started talking about doing this interview, that's something that I wish I had information on years and years ago. My wife and I, we've been together 17 years, and that was probably for 15, 16 years an issue. And that's on that magic sex number.
Yeah.
How
could it not be, right?
You do mention those amazing couples that have so much richness and things that it's just a non-issue for them. But can you explain to us what is the magic sex number?
Okay, so there's this notion, if we can use a metaphor comparing sex and sexual appetites to dietary appetites, where my wife and I eat 3,000 calories a day, she eats 2,000 calories a day, and it never crosses our minds that, well, she should be more like me, and she should be bumping that up, or he should be eating as few calories as I do on her part. And we just accept caloric intake or even the number of hours of sleep or any of our other basic human needs as, well, that's what they need in order to not survive. It's what they need in order to thrive. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of linguistic confusion there because we do use the word need in both senses, like you need food and water and shelter to survive. But all of us would agree children need an education or children need friends. And then, adults need friends too if we're going to be normal. I mean, unless you're going to be some kind of monk out in the woods talking to the critters, you are going to need human friends. And I think when it comes to sexuality, we all have a set point in our appetites. And it seems to run true in my experience as a therapist over the last 30 years. This appetite seems to be very consistent over time. So it's not a matter of, we just met each other, so we're all over each other. Or, well, that was when I was young, and now I'm 55 or 60 or whatever. It's a pretty solid, consistent number where some people, their preferred number, their magic number of most optimum number of sexual encounters is quite high, like something like 10 or even 20. I think the record was set by one of the couples. They married compatibly, and they were at 28 times a week.
Wow.
And that's where they were. And for them, it was legitimate, and it was just where they were. And if you can imagine either a bell-shaped curve or even just a straight line that's a continuum, of course there are going to be people in the middle, but there's also going to be people on the extreme ends. And some people's preferred number of sexual encounters is really close to zero or at zero for the asexual, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for some people, and I saw a survey that included these numbers, for some people, it was once per year. Now I'm thinking once per year, why would you even bother? I mean, gosh, but it's true that I only celebrate Christmas once a year. So maybe that makes sense for them. And other people very commonly, very, very commonly prefer sex once or twice a month. So what I try to tell my clients is to really take some time and to have an intentional interview that covers an awful lot of ground, but cannot fail to cover talking about sexuality. I mean, why would anybody try to have a sex life for the rest of their life with a partner who's not comfortable talking about sexuality?
Yeah.
That makes no sense.
I think the thing that blew me away the most was you talking about, because you think, well, I'm a person, I like to have sex every day. Well, this person likes to have sex every other day. And,
yes. And which of us is normal?
Yeah, well, of course, there is that desire that everyone has to be normal. And here on this show, typically we use the word healthy, but people actually strive to be normal and not healthy. There's so many times where I have had to tell my clients or patients when I was working in the psych field that, just because something is normal doesn't make it healthy.
Yeah. And I would use the word typical, just because something is typical, like spanking a kid.
Yeah.
That might be typical, but I don't think that's very healthy.
Right. So thinking about the difference in every day and every other day, that one person is twice as much or the other person is only half as much as their partner.
Their appetites are that different, yes.
And it's just mind-blowing, because going into it and being in relationships like that myself, where, no, this is an everyday need for me, and other people, because we do talk about it in BDSM, open and honest communication is, one of the three primary things that is talked about, that is absolute must, because as some refer to it, we're playing at the speed of sound, and you can get really hurt really quickly if you don't.
Right.
So, we have an entire negotiation process. In fact, I have vanilla listeners, non-kinky listeners, that will contact me, and they tell me that they listen because they don't care about the kink, any of that. What they care about are the rules to love by, which rule number 1, safe, sane, consensual, and informed. Rule number 2 is kinky, which comes from an app, but it stands for knowledge, no intolerance, kindness, and integrity. And the third, a quote from Paul Young that says, submission is not about authority or obedience. It's about relationships of love and respect. But in the first pillar, safe, sane, consensual, in order for it to be known and to be consensual, it has to be talked about. So we tend to talk about everything.
Well, it makes so much sense. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was thinking about, if you and I, we've never met, but let's say we got to know each other and we wanted to start a business partnership, you would want to know, and rightfully so, all about my finances, my financial history, what are my goals and my intentions and my appetite for risk. And those are, and we routinely have those conversations when it's about anything at all in life other than sex.
Mm-hmm.
But with sex, typically what we do is we feel a physical attraction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And often enough, that's followed by an emotional connection because we've now fallen in love. And unfortunately, we completely leave out the cognitive part of everything because, and it's unfortunate because I find an enormous number of people physically attractive, and I find it very easy to fall in love. I mean genuinely in love, very fond and or deeply fond of someone, love at first sight, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to discover and uncover the necessary and sufficient conditions for a successful relationship it really takes a lot of conversation. And in that interview, one of the things we want to ask about is, if you could be in your ideal relationship, that was perfect for you in every way, about how often would you want to be having sex?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people choke because they're not used to talking about sex at all. And what I encourage my clients to do, and I'm going to encourage all our listeners to do, is if you meet somebody who's a little bit, bulky at doing something at disclosing something like that, because, they're trying to make a good impression on you and they don't want to say a bad number because a bad number might alienate you. And so what I encourage everybody to do is just, have this conversation at a restaurant or some other public place, and then to flip over a cocktail napkin and write down your numbers and hold the number down to the table until you're ready to disclose it. And then maybe we both agree, okay, let's turn our napkins over at the same time. And if her number is, let's just say her number is a once per week kind of a number, and mine is a 7, that's really a big gulf.
Mm-hmm.
That would mean that if we were to be a couple, assuming we were into some sort of a monogamous contract, if we were to be a couple, that would mean I want sex at about 7 times as often as she does, and she wants it 1/7 as frequently as I do,
mm-hmm.
or vice versa. And there's nothing, what's so funny about this is that when we have no discussions about this stuff and we're very naive about it, we tend to emotionalize and moralize the information as if, if she doesn't want sex, it's probably because she was molested and was a child victim.
Yeah.
Or she's got hang-ups about her body. And once we work through that issue, the key goes in the lock, the tumblers fall right into place, and oh boy, it'll be sex every day, and boy, will she love it. And on her side, she's thinking, well, clearly he's a sex addict. And once he discovers what real love is all about, he won't need to have sex that often because he'll be so satisfied with the emotional connection.
Yeah.
And those are both pipe dreams, because what they both fail to do is to respect our human sexuality for the very powerful force that it is in our lives. I mean, it's maybe the most powerful force in our human lives, right up there with our propensity for survival itself.
Yeah. It does seem to be my driving force most of the time. whether it's, and I'm joking, but I'm serious. Whether it is putting in a very full week of work or doing the date night thing or whatever it may be, it always leads me to that thing, because I'm one of those 7 to 10. That would be my number, probably somewhere between. Well, there you go. That lowballing you, as you talked about in that TEDx talk.
Right.
Mine would be somewhere between 7 and 14. Once to twice a week, or a day, once to twice a day.
Well, I think what's hard about somebody sitting by themselves listening to this is, of course, their number exists in the vacuum of very few conversations.
Yes.
But imagine you're sitting in a group of 10 or 12 individuals, and for the sake of reducing the conflicts, let's say it's a group of male heteros, or even a mixed group of male, hetero, and homosexual clients. They're sitting around and they're talking about their magic sex number. And we do a quick survey around the room, and we hear numbers like 1, 3, 7, 15, and so on, all the way around the room. And then I look at the group, and I look in their eyes one by one, and I say, and which of us is normal? And it's at that moment that they look at each other and they realize we're all normal.
Man, that is powerful.
It is. It's so liberating. It's so liberating to realize my number is what it is, and I don't have to fight that. I can surrender to it. I can just go with it. And even if I'm in a committed relationship, I just have this faith that the truth is our friend.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the truth is, even if my wife turns out, let's say I'm doing a postmortem on a previous nuptial, and she's a 7 times a week kind of a gal, and he's a once a week kind of a guy, it just helps them to understand that it's a matter of appetite, not of love.
Yeah.
It's not about how they value each other. It has nothing to do with morality or psychology or the value they hold of the relationship. It's none of that. It's not about abuse. Nobody's trying to withhold sex in this type of situation I'm talking about, although people have been known to do that, of course, to abuse people and try to control them.
Oh, when sex turns into a game of manipulation.
Right. And, this is why I was looking forward to this conversation with you, is because, I think people in the BDSM community really, really understand that consensual, ritualized play between two people presents everyone with a deep opportunity for real emotional and spiritual connections.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're thinking outside of that very, very much other opinionated box that is mainstream, they're open to, I think, being the first people in the community, just like my gay clients typically are more liberated than my straight clients about, disclosing who they really are with others. And I think within the BDSM community, there's just so much freedom to begin talking about this as, well, this is a part of who I am, and I'm glad I came out of denial about it. It's just, this is my magic sex number. I have this strong of an appetite. And it doesn't mean I'm less than. It doesn't mean I'm sexually hung up. It doesn't mean I'm a sex addict. It doesn't, but even among therapists, I have to tell you, I've talked to so many therapists who talk to couples, and they find out she wants sex 2 or 3 times a week. He wants sex once or twice a day. And the therapist unconsciously assigns a bias against the person who wants sex more often and tries to therapeutically, if you can imagine that, pose interventions to help bring down that sex number.
Wow.
I mean, they might as well feed them drugs, right? To like antidepressants or maybe something else that would bring down their sexual drive, maybe some hormones to artificially bring it down, right?
Let's chemically castrate someone who is perfectly healthy.
Right. Instead of accepting normal human sexual diversity.
Yeah. That's
and that it's all normal.
Yeah, a lot of this, anytime that I talk to someone about sex, and a lot of this conversation and that magic sex number, and talking about appetite, obviously there's other motivators for sex. Oscar Wilde, one of my favorite quotes, is that everything in life is about sex except for sex itself, which is about power. So does the power of sex in your 30 years of counseling, is that something that feeds that appetite for a few, some, many, the majority of clients? That has that come up as an issue or a purpose or reason for their sexual appetite?
Well, that is such a loaded and really great question, because I think that for the majority of my clients, people who are not in the BDSM community, for example, I would say that they don't understand power. And so they use it unconsciously to try to get what they want, either by shaming their partner or by trying to, let's say, bribe their partner with gifts or with some other accommodation. And I think that people in the BDSM community are far more open to understanding that we can play with power. We can enjoy power and enjoy that energy, kind of like, I have a friend who's a martial artist and he studies Aikido. And in Aikido, the intention is never to hurt the other person. The intention is simply to take energy and play around with it however you want to take it. And the truly accomplished martial artist is the one who can diffuse energy without needing to hurt somebody. And I think the same thing can be applied to our sex lives, because violence and sex are so closely intertwined. And why not enjoy power, and why not make it really that ritual part of that ritual play of a deep emotional and spiritual connection? Now, the play, I think the people who make the mistake of substituting power as somehow trying to make it the heart of the relationship, I think that misses the point. I mean, the point is the connection. The point is the actual intimacy that the couple shares. The power is just, it's like for some people in the furry community putting on their costumes, or other people they call themselves, what is it? I forget what we used to call them, wife swappers.
Oh, the swingers.
Swingers, but they have a new name now. It's besides swingers, they don't use that term anymore either. And I don't mean any disrespect to that community, but for some people, the titillation of swapping partners is the thing. It's the heart of the matter. Mm-hmm. Whereas for people who really get it, it's the way in which they share sexual communion with one another. Mm-hmm. And for them, sexual power is at its best when that bomb is utterly diffused by themselves, seeing themselves as bomb disposal experts who carefully cut the proper wire to make sure the bomb doesn't go off. And that's one reason why people in that swinging community have an incredibly low divorce rate. Because for them, it's not about power and control, and it's not about morality. It's just a thing they like to share with their partner and with friends and others, like some people like to go golfing together. Mm-hmm. So,
now, you just said something that is incredibly, incredibly interesting to me, again, which is the divorce rate within the swinger community is incredibly low. Now, according to pop psychology and Dr. Phil and, things, people, books that I've read, they highly recommend that this is a very inappropriate and unhealthy lifestyle, and children raised in this type of environment will turn into, demented, obscene creatures. And that there's, I think the last statistic, which we all know, they insert any number here, percentage of statistics are made up. But a 60 to 75% seems to be what people go with divorce rate within the swinger community or within open marriages. And there is a very large swinger community here in Knoxville. I'm myself not part of it per se, but I do. There's a club that one night is mainly dedicated to BDSM play, and the other night of the weekend is dedicated to swinger play. And we all kind of intermingle in this club, which is highly unusual for those two communities to get together, because we completely play by different rules. My experience is swingers, when they party in the traditional sense of the word, with drinking and having a good time in that way, where with BDSM, it's very, very important to us, most of us, and I'm throwing out I'm painting with a very large brush here when I say this, but most of us, it's very important to remain sober. With the things that we do, they can be extremely dangerous, and we don't need that added danger of intoxication.
Yeah, it'd be like driving while drunk.
Yes, and more dangerous, actually, because we are doing things that are intentionally dangerous instead of just trying to make it from the bar to the house.
Right.
So going back to that, you say it's lower. I think we're up to about a 51% divorce rate in America.
Yes. So let's take a look. Let's unpack some of this.
Yes.
I think you're a guy who likes great quotes, and here's one from Mark Twain. He said there are three types of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. So when we put statistics out there, we have to really understand where and how they come from. And I remember now what is the preferred term, I think, within the community, and then they call themselves, modestly enough, the lifestyle. So swingers typically, at least in the West Coast, they prefer that term, the lifestyle. And in the lifestyle, you got two very distinct groups. You've got groups where it's consensual and wholehearted by both he and she, or he and the partner, whatever their genders are. Mm-hmm. And then you've got this other group, and I think you can easily imagine this, where he is profoundly dissatisfied. He's gotten tired of that same old pussy. He's only capable of titillation. His whole sex drive is centered around titillating elements of the relationship. And now that he's had sex with her for umpty-ump months or years, he desperately needs something else in order to just simply function. And for a lot of guys, that's porn. Mm-hmm. And for some guys, that's getting into the lifestyle. And those guys typically are guys who are incapable of intimacy. The relationship is incredibly lonely and disconnected for both of them. And they make up the majority, I think, of people who go into the lifestyle. Because what happens is he nags his wife into doing this, pressuring her. This can even save our marriage. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to so many wives who said, well, I didn't want to do it, but I did it because I thought, it would make me more interesting to him, that we would have something we'd share in common. I didn't want him to cheat secretly, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So they end up in the lifestyle, and it's very uncomfortable and unsatisfying for them. And it's only when they get smacked around with the reality of what that lifestyle is that they realize, oh, yeah, I can't live like this. Mm. And he, at that point, is utterly invested in it. How many people in our society are constitutionally incapable of intimacy? I'd like your listeners to remember this, if nothing at all today, and that is the number of people in our society who have personality disorders is conservatively estimated to be 19%. I mean, these are people we're talking about who are so fractured so undeveloped in their personalities, they depend on one trait instead of the hundreds of traits other human beings have to address life problems. And these individuals are not capable of being there for us. And you add to that the percentage of the population that is actively abusing substances, the number goes up to about 25% if you include other mental illnesses that are untreated or debilitating. And really, you're lucky to have maybe only a 1 out of 4 shot at running into a relational dead end with somebody. If you're not carefully interviewing people and getting to know them before you commit, and I don't mean just spending a year, I mean really talking, including about sexuality, and especially, I would say, intimacy, which everybody thinks when I say the word intimacy, I'm talking about intercourse. No, if I want to talk about intercourse, I'm going to talk about intercourse. But when we're talking about intimacy, I mean that meaningful connection. Speaking of sex and group therapy, I'll be in a room of, let's say, all hetero men, and as we go around the room sharing our lives, somebody will share a disclosure that's quite personal and very, like the fact that maybe he's attracted to his wife's sister, for example. Mm-hmm. And somebody in the group will say, well, have you ever disclosed that to your wife? Well, God, no. Are you kidding? She would kill me. But that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is, so what you're saying is that you have more sexual intimacy with a group of heterosexual men than you do with your life partner. There's something really wrong with that.
Wow.
So the challenge is how well do I really want to know my partner? Do I really want to know them? I do a lot of interviews with clients, of course, and a number of them are for forensic reasons. And I'll ask them a question. a leading question like, can you and your partner talk comfortably about sex? And 100% of the time, the answer is yes. Then I'll follow up with, a number of questions like, tell me about how often you like sex, or what do you think about when you're having sex? How many sexual partners have you had in your life? And what are your sexual fantasies? How often do you masturbate? And he'll answer those questions with me, a complete stranger, very comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I ask, and what about your wife? What are her sexual fantasies? How often does she masturbate? What does she think about when she's having sex with you? The answers are all, I don't know. Gee, we've never talked about that. Oh, I thought that was something we should never talk about. So that's where we are. We're, as a society, we are collectively in denial about the lack of intimacy that we share with each other.
You've got to love the issues that puritanical foundation has set us up for failure.
Well, I've often been tempted to offer a bird dog feed to every pastor in the town for screwing so many people up sexually because I end up with them as clients. But it's not just the religious, and it's not just Protestant evangelicals. It's not just Catholics or Mormons. It's really everybody. No matter what the demographic is of your community, I can guarantee you, if you have 10% atheists and agnostics, you're going to have 10% of the therapeutic community with sexual problems being atheist or agnostic. It crosses all the lines.
Here in the South, because I'm just outside of Knoxville and I grew up in Georgia, thankfully I am well traveled. But here in the South, it has amazed me in working one-on-one with therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, the level of ignorance, misunderstanding, prejudice, and just out-and-out bigotry that I have personally witnessed based on, well, that's just not right. And that's and that tends to be the reasoning. It's not even, well, the Bible says, or, well, it's just been studied that is unhealthy. No, their reasoning for how they feel or believe and what they project onto their clients or patients is, well, that's just not right. You don't need to be doing that.
You are so right, and you are going to owe me for this term from now on. So I expect some kind of credits. But for me, what I observe from the vast majority in the therapeutic community is that they tender a moral diagnosis,
yes,
rather than a mental health diagnosis.
Yes.
Yeah, right?
You're exactly right.
This moral diagnosis isn't really, we know about sexual pathology. We know, but here's the big divide. Sexual pathology is a pathology because it's only a problem if it creates problems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by creating problems, I certainly don't mean, somebody in the community disapproves of me and that's a problem. Or my spouse thinks I'm really a bad person for feeling this way and that's a problem. No, we're not talking about other people's reactions. We're talking about the individual patient's ability to give and receive love, because love, at the end of the day, is that quality that separates those of us who are human from those of us who are inhuman.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can receive a loving, consensual sexual relationship in the context of my sexual interests and what works for me, and I can also receive, let's say I'm into BDSM and I enjoy that, but I'm also able to enjoy those times when my partner and I are just not particularly demonstrative of that part of our sexual play.
Mm-hmm.
I feel equally connected. I can still get an erection. I can still have an orgasm. I'm totally functional. And I love my wife that day as much as I do on the days where we engage in play. Well, now that's a normal person. But for some outsider to come in and say, let's say you have a partner who's horrified that you want to be flogged, or that you want to be have a ball gag put in your mouth, and you think that would be really fun. And they go to therapy over it. Usually, of course, it starts with going to pastoral counseling first. Can we all agree? I mean, I'm hoping every listener can agree that masturbation is a universal and normal part of human sexuality.
Yes.
It's a perfect normal behavior. So I know of fundamentalist clients who have outed their mate at church as a masturbator. And the individual, the now publicly identified masturbator, had to go forward to receive the laying on of hands and a full exorcism of the demon of masturbation.
I think
Can you imagine?
my head just kind of imploded a little bit there.
Yeah, and this is why, I got to tell you, might surprise some of our listeners, but I still am a Christian, and I love Christ. I love the Bible. I love everything about Christianity. Oh, except the church. I can't even go into a church anymore because it is so fundamental, whether they're liberal or conservative, and no matter what flavor, because I've pretty much tried them all, they are all contributing to the sexual dysfunction of the general population.
Yes.
And this is why increasing numbers of young people are looking at religion and turning to alternatives. And honestly, I think now you must have seen this just like a couple of weeks ago. It came out in the news that the number of pagans in the United States has overtaken the number of Presbyterians in the United States.
No, I didn't see that, but that's fascinating.
I think it's like the numbers are 1.4 million versus 1.3 million.
Wow.
And that is a very telling statistic because it doesn't even, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you start adding all the people who are agnostic and atheist who've deliberately turned away from the religion of their parents, the number would be much bigger, and it's growing all the time. And the great thing about sex, and I think the thing that religions wrongfully fear about sex, is that the same awe and mystery and wonder that we hopefully would experience in religion, but so seldom do, is offered to us by sexuality. There's the same mystical connection between me and my partner. There's that same awe of the ungodly amount of beauty that I'm seeing that is just so wonderful. And there's this sense of humility that I have done nothing to deserve this much beauty in my life, this much love in my life. And, I didn't need to go to church and pay some Bible head to thump on a pulpit. I didn't need to be shamed. I got to get all of that without being abused. That is what church is for most of us, right? It's a mild beating that we get once a week. And that's why I like to say most church people, especially the fundamentalists, evangelicals, or your Southern Baptists and the rest, they're closeted BDSM. They like their sex with a certain amount of shame and humiliation and pain. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel normal.
Yeah. And growing up in that environment, I was actually an ordained Southern Baptist youth minister for a brief amount of time as one of the many masks that I've worn throughout my life. But what you're saying about, sex almost being a spiritual experience. Are you familiar with 9 Inch Nails? I want to f you like an animal,
yes,
is the chorus, which ends with "You get me closer to God." And that has always been something that I personally have related to, because that is where I found the freedom. And I've been promising for 2 years now to do an episode on BDSM and religion. So this is kind of a precursor to that. But I think this leads us really well into getting into your textbook, because you have certainly shown a vast knowledge of what you do. You are absolutely a professional in it. And the amount of time you've been doing this for 30 years is just amazing. Now, your book, We're All Like This, that's used as a textbook in human sexuality classes at the university level, correct?
Right. Now, what's funny about that, if I could just interject this, is it's a book that stylistically, I was inspired by a children's book called Goodnight Moon. A lot of us have read that to our kids or had that read to us because it's quite old, but it's a classic. And we identified 27 different sexual needs that human beings have by simply doing a thought experiment. And the thought experiment was, imagine having the perfect sex life, perfect in every way. And then we would systematically take out one element and ask the question, would it still be perfect? So one example would be, let's say you have the perfect sex life, perfect in every way, with a partner who's got the same magic sex number and all the rest, but we take out play and humor, so that every sexual encounter starts with a kind of a grim, okay, let's do this.
Yeah, no, that'd absolutely kill it for me.
Yeah, that wouldn't work anymore, right?
No.
Or the sexual life with the perfect partner who's totally willing, everything is going on except your partner is absolutely incapable of integrating sexuality with spirituality. So you can never have those kinds of conversations with this partner. And again, it just keeps growing and growing from that. I have a quote for you if you ever decide to do more on this idea about sex and religion, because it's from Sir Thomas More. Remember him? Man for All Seasons. Sometimes it's Saint Thomas More. He said, sex and religion are closer to each other than either might prefer.
Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, me too.
And that's, well, within BDSM, there's two camps there, as there always seems to be. Those that are kinky, so they prefer their pleasure and pain to be mixed with a sexual side to it, or the finishing act of a scene or a play session.
Right.
And then those that are just strictly into S&M or the dominant submissive side of it, where sex can be a fun part of it, but it's not included most of the time. And either side of the coin, where they meet in the middle is catharsis. And a lot of people don't realize, I think I've mentioned this before on the show, a large portion of the Southern Baptist hymnal was written by a woman walking a maze in the front of the church between the pews and the pulpit. There was a maze carved into the floor, and as she would walk, she would flog herself and go into a cathartic trance. And she would just start singing these songs where basically like an altar boy or someone sitting by would write these down.
Right.
And who was also musically inclined, it would come up with accompaniment music, basically. Of course, we're talking, 150, 200, 300 years ago. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've researched this person, but for the listeners, I will put it in the show notes. But I think where you're getting into that spirituality or religion, which are two totally different things, as you are aware,
right,
and sexuality, I think often for us being the BDSM players, that is where they meet, is in that cathartic state, that release of whatever it is, of joy, of pain, of pleasure, that bringing ourselves out of our head in a way that will allow for improvement. And that is one of the most interesting side effects to me that BDSM has. It is forcing people.
I agree with you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Please go on. I love hearing this.
It's we push ourselves to better ourselves, and we call it play. And there are some kink-friendly therapists, very few in the South, but they do exist, and they will prescribe cathartic sessions to their kinky, and if they can recommend it to someone who is non-kinky, they will try to slip it in there. But in talking to some of them, and I need to get some of them on the show as well, but that is often what creates some of the biggest breakthroughs. I do what's called service topping. So if someone has a particular need that they don't have anyone to fulfill for them, a non-sexual need, I'm a non-sexual service top, whether it's flogging or electrical play, wax, some rigging or rope play. I'm not what we call a rigger, means I'm not a master of the art, but they will come to me and I will perform a specific type of scene with them so that they can find this release. And I say find because it's a journey.
Well, that's just such a kind and loving thing that you're doing. I mean, that's just very touching, that story.
The energy transference between us is why I do it. Because when you are that intimate with someone, even though it's servicing them, there's such a trust, which growing up to go to Freudian psychology, massive concealment of all truth within my family and no trust whatsoever, because where there is secrets, there is dishonesty. Right. And so it provides with me, someone who I may have never even met before to someone who I've been friends with for 30 years to develop rapidly in this scene and prior to the scene through the act of negotiations, this level of compassion, trust, and intimacy between us that causes this flow to where it also brings me into a cathartic state. And I remember the few sermons I've performed, funerals and weddings and all the standard good pastoral duties, but standing in front of a congregation and putting out there what at the time I truly believed in a way that they needed to hear it for themselves because they expressed to me how they best hear things. So there's a similarity there of being that dominant figure in a religious organization and presenting their truth that brings them their own amount of shame, as you said moments ago, because the religious do often like shame and pain with their sexual activity, but it charges them and gives them what they need for the week. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I'm certainly not wrapping things up, but I just had to thank you again for this while we're in the midst of it.
Well, honestly, I feel the same level of gratitude. I'm just very appreciative of these kinds of conversations. And like I said, so many people in the BDSM community seem to be so much more free to really, ponder these kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. I know for me as an outsider looking in at the community, I see someone like you still performing. I mean, the true identity that you have is that of a minister who is serving people. And whether we call it, now you use the word servicing, which sounds like stud service or something, but it's serving people by helping them, especially the isolated or the lonely people who have no other person to turn to. Yeah. I just find that to be a very spiritual thing. And we kind of glossed over, and it's my fault, a subject you brought up just a few minutes back, and that was, talking about our animal nature. And, for me, it's rather a remarkable spiritual discovery to see how getting in touch with our animal nature promotes spiritual growth. Mm-hmm. So that, we can finally be free as we step into our private spaces or our bedrooms. We can be free to shrug off the veneer of civilization and just be the animals we always have been, but we're in denial of.
Mm-hmm. Which can tend to cause a lot of guilt and shame in people because unfortunately, we raise people to hide these things and to not let that. We call it to truly relate to the animal side, being a primal player, but really we all are when we are forcing ourselves, in some cases, typically allowing ourselves to undergo certain acts that the rest of the world would see as so taboo.
Right.
And that brings me back to your book, We're All Like This. And you said that was kind of based on the children's book and the style that it's written in. Now, talking to children about sex and BDSM relationships. Yeah,
that was a topic that came up, right? And we skipped over that.
how do you recommend this? Is this something that people come to you and ask you about often? I would imagine, being that you're a sexuality specialist and you've written the book that you have, it would be something that happens on a regular basis, I would think.
In the book, we could start with this idea. We would all agree that the very first need that we all have as human beings, including the baby who was just born, is the need for sexual safety. We need to be kept safe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've had fundamentalists argue with me about that, saying, oh, that's physical. No, I could think of different sexual situations that you wouldn't want your baby to be, around, and you would feel angry and that your baby had been violated. And I describe those and go, yeah, you're right. That's true. Safety is more than just physical safety. And there's another sexual need when we talk about children, and that also never goes away. None of our sexual needs ever go away, but they are different from prepubescent, postpubescent.
Mm-hmm.
One of our other sexual needs is the need for sexual innocence. And that might sound strange on a BDSM podcast to be talking about the need for sexual innocence. But even you as an adult, I can tell you that some of the sexual stories I've gotten into, you don't want those pictures in your brain. You don't want to be thinking about certain things. And frankly,
mm-hmm.
there are things out there that I really am not ready to hear about, and things that would just be overwhelming.
And sexual innocence, to me, is something that is, subjective as opposed to objective?
Certainly, and it absolutely is.
So
right?
the things that I do that are consensual, that other people would say is obscene or hardcore or crazy, or, insert derogatory term here.
Right.
But to me, it's sexually innocent because it doesn't harm me. It doesn't harm the other party or parties involved. Therefore, there is an innocence to it. And that's...
Well, yeah, and the innocence is also true that in that it's sexual play, which is what healthy children do. And it's perfectly normal. I just get so frustrated as a therapist when some of the stories that I've heard when it's sexuality that's considered the bad thing,
mm-hmm.
and the abuse is considered the good thing.
So not to talk about normal or what was the term that you used? Typical. Let's talk average. Just real briefly to touch on these. What would you say is the average age for a boy or girl to start masturbating?
Well, honestly, it's going to shock people who don't know, but children touch themselves even as toddlers. And touching their genitals, if we're talking about auto arousal, mm-hmm. Through physical stimulation, and that's masturbation, well, they start masturbating, most of us, as very young toddlers.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't typically masturbate as in the prepubescent years, and unless we've been sexually abused. But I've talked to many parents who are quite confident their children have never been sexually abused, but have already started masturbating in a very decidedly prepubescent time frame.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of average, if we could again remember Dr. Kinsey's words, we're all different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a range. I like the word range, and there's a range of normalcy. And in that range, there's a room for a near infinite level of diversity. But when we're talking about, when you brought this up, gosh, long time ago in this conversation, about how much of our sexuality do we want to let children in on? And I personally think talking about coitus or intercourse, talking about sexual play, talking about role playing or BDSM themes, I think that's personally a violation of the incest taboo, when we're talking about talking to our children.
Mm-hmm.
I think instead, there's an infinite number of topics that we could talk about that would be so much more helpful to children, because if you're doing a great job of raising your children, you don't know where they're going to end up on a sexual spectrum. They may be gay, they may be straight, they may be bi, they may be asexual, they may be interested in BDSM, they may hate BDSM.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all okay, right? You can still be a very normal sexual being within all of those parentheses on our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, I think understanding that sexuality doesn't start with intercourse. Sexuality starts with feelings. It starts with thoughts. And to normalize that it's a normal thing for our children to have sexual thoughts and feelings. And even to say that is a little bit on the creepy side.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I would say to my fourth grader or my third grader, I might say something like, that's when I had my first crush. So that the talk is based on a personal disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And you got the attention of your third grader now, and they're looking at you with these big eyes. And yeah, my teacher, she was just so pretty. I remember Miss Henderson, and I fell in love with her that year.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to discuss the emotion of it.
Right?
Because,
and it's still sexual, right?
I mean, you can sit down and you can talk about the mechanics, and they pretty much have the mechanics figured out by the time the talk happens. You touch it, you rub it, it feels good.
Yes.
Wash, rinse, repeat, as it says on the shampoo bottle.
Right.
But the emotional side, and people who don't believe that sex starts with the emotion or the psychological side just needs to think about that time where it felt really good and they were going and going and going, and they kept going and going and going and just couldn't get there. They never were able to finish the race.
Right.
And it was because that one little thing that they were thinking about, or that one big thing, whatever, that just prevented it. I mean, that in itself is pure proof that sex is so much more than physical.
Well, yes. And this kind of approach frees the parents from that really awkward, uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
kind of discussion,
Mm-hmm.
and to begin talking about things just a little more normally.
Mm-hmm.
My adult clients are really put off for a second when I say, I remember the last time I kissed a 6-year-old. My pause. And I was 6 years old at the time. And then you see everybody relax. And is that a sexual moment? Well, sure it is.
Yeah.
Because sex doesn't start off with intercourse. Sex starts off with attraction. It starts off with thoughts and behavior. It starts off with, and then the discussions about consent. Why would we jump into a conversation with our 13-year-old or our 12-year-old about intercourse when we haven't yet had 100 conversations about consent?
Yeah.
Those conversations can be something as simple as, I remember how I didn't know how to ask for a girl to hold my hand. And I would just awkwardly grab her hand to see if I could get consent.
Mm-hmm.
And if she didn't pull her hand away, then that meant I had consent, which I now call consent by Braille. I use the touch method.
Mm-hmm.
And now I train parents and young people to simply ask, I really like to hold your hand right now, or make a statement. I'd really like to hold your hand. Or to simply non-verbally hold your hand out to the other person. And they can choose to take it or not, but there's absolute consent in both cases.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kids need to know that before they need to know about intercourse.
But for the sake of education and conversation here, say and I don't have any children, but say I did, and my 10-year-old walked into the bedroom where my wife was in some kind of shackled, awkward position, and I was flogging her, and we were naked, and I'm standing there in all my glory with an erection, and
right. How do you handle that?
Yeah, how do you explain that? This is a question that I get frequently from listeners. Is not just, okay, my kid's 13 and I want to share with them a little bit more about our relationship in case they ever walk in. And it's like pre-planning, because the pillar of open and honest communication, we don't want to shock them with it.
Well, you may not like my answer, but I'm going to say that what all children need to get from their parents is that sex is a wonderful and normal part of life. and that it deserves a lot of attention and exploration. And that part of the children's sexual innocence means being protected from that vision of walking in on both mom and dad or grandpa and grandma.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want those pictures in my head. I don't want to think about that because it is a violation of the taboo. So, in other words, all the work that everyone in the BDSM community does conscientiously about consent, having your children walk in on an unlocked door is really depriving them of consent. So for me, as a therapist, and looking at the kinds of the needs of innocence and the effects of trauma on the human psyche, a 10-year-old is not ready for that vision you just painted.
Right.
A 10-year-old doesn't even know how to begin processing that and is still full of ignorance about a million other subjects, sexual subjects, that need to be covered by you as a loving parent. So I don't know, once the cat is out of the bag, let's say, and I've already had the problem of my kids walking in on me, well, the first step is I need to commit to never letting that happen again. And so I'm going to take my play outside of the house to areas where it's deliberately set up for a child-free environment. Or if I'm going to do it at home, I'm going to get a deadbolt on my door. And when the play is on, and that means teaching my children that when mommy and daddy are having private time, you need to respect that. And if you don't respect that, you're going to have some unpleasant consequences.
Yeah.
So that can be private. And then, boy, I mean, with the 1,000,001 sexual options that they have in their sexual future in terms of play, experimentation, and all the rest, BDSM is just a tiny part of that world because there's an infinite world out there. And so they'll discover, it's not like it's a secret anymore. They're going to discover BDSM on their own. There would be a much more normative way of handling that. The normal way of handling that would be handling it intellectually, dispassionately, and not personally, and with a personal disclosure as you would with an adult friend. So there's a BDSM scene in a movie, which is increasingly common even in TV shows. And they say, Daddy, what is that? Or Mommy, what's that all about? And to just say, well, some people like to have this kind of sexual play. Period. End of message. Because if that kid has more questions, like, yeah, but doesn't that hurt? Or why would they do that? You get to answer that question. And the whole idea is we want these conversations to be safe, not, well, your mom and I have been doing that for the last 10 years. In fact, I remember the night you were conceived.
Yeah, that's definitely a breach of that innocence.
It is. And it's a breach of, I think, our universal need for sexual privacy.
One of the questions that you just said that a child may have in that type of setting, doesn't that hurt? I found an excellent way to describe that is that people have used, again, I don't have children, but that dipping of the toe into a hot bath.
Yes.
Where at first it sends that little chilled sensation through your body.
Right.
A heat chill instead of a cold chill. And it's just something that, yeah, some people like that sensation and other people don't, and both is okay.
Yes.
I'm somebody that does enjoy it and go from there.
Do you use that with adults too?
I do. Vanilla's
it's a great illustration.
Thank you.
And I approached it. I may use that in the future with your permission.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I have been using a slightly different take on it in that, at a romantic dinner, your would-be lover may reach across the table and just gently with a single finger touch your hand. And it's electrifying. It's absolutely wonderful and it's very meaningful. However, in the throes of passion in the bedroom, that sort of touch gets lost in all the white noise of the other touching.
Yes.
So that we need increasingly intense touches. And that's why spanking, which would be horribly out of place at some stages of a relationship, might be just what the doctor ordered at other stages of the relationship.
And I love the fact that you point out that there are those different stages of the relationship where at times this is appropriate. It's just it's more than appropriate, as you put it. It's just what the doctor ordered, where at other times it's vastly, vastly inappropriate and could be detrimental to someone's psyche or the relationship or a million and one different things.
Yeah.
I like that too. And so good. Such good information here.
I really am open to continuing this conversation because we've only covered about 10,000 miles, and there's another 30,000 probably we could cover.
Excellent.
And, before we sign off, I also wanted to say, how much I appreciate the people in the BDSM community who are listening to this, because they are seekers, and I do believe that they will be rewarded. And as a fellow seeker, I just really appreciate knowing that they exist and that they're out there and they're listening to a podcast like this.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means a lot. It does. The openness that you have shared here and the level of respect and understanding that you have for this community and the human psyche in general, it's astonishing, which is sad in itself, because that's the point of what I do, is to educate others and hopefully broaden the horizons and open the mind and reduce the prejudice. So I think that you have done an excellent job, and I look very, very, very much forward to speaking with you again in the future for a part 2, where we can hit on some of the more personal experiences that you've had in counseling people within the lifestyle, maybe, if there's any generalizations that you could give on that in the future.
Absolutely. And, there's so many other topics you and I think could address, because we're both wired this way. But, sexuality and spirituality, I think, is another hot topic for the two of us.
Yeah.
Because for so many people, it's one or the other.
And it should be both.
Right. Absolutely.
But
you know what, Ryan? It's been a delight.
It has been. Thank you so much. Krypters, check Stephen Ing out. That is STEVENING at StephenIng.com. Thank you for sticking through to the end. A final note or two. Thank you to the executive producer, Jeremiah, Silas, Jess, and Arcane Dagger and Violet Atrelia. Our senior producers, Matt and Emerald Wolf. Producers, Kane Sin, That Place in Oklahoma City. Thank you, Miter, JK, and Roxy Bear. And our junior producers, K2SO, Buffalo Dom 84, Payne Waits, Leisumi, and Haley. If you would like to become one of our show producers, go to the website kuldrinscrypt.com/support to get that information. Second, BDSMcontracts.org. Thank you so much for your donation of your beautiful 25-page soft and hardbound MS and DS contracts. You can find them at BDSMcontracts.org. Use coupon code Kuldrin20, that's KULDRIN 20, no space, for a 20% discount on all purchases. And finally, whippingstripes.com, my personal maker of everything leather and paracord impact toys. Check them out at whippingstripes.com. They do make custom orders. This has been Master Kuldrin and psychotherapist Stephen Ing for KuldrinsCrypt.com. Unearth the truth.